Get ready for a trauma dump.
Settle in. Wrap yourself tight in a blanket.
Welcome to Please Bless This podcast. This is the podcast where two sisters talk about all things Mormon and pop culture. And sometimes we talk about ourselves.
Yeah. Here's a special 20th episode extravaganza where we just unleash like all of our, I don't know, trauma.
Get ready for a trauma dump.
Yeah. Trigger warning if you don't want to like feel sad,
No, I mean, we've been doing this for a minute and we're like, should we like say a little bit about who we are and what we're doing and why? Maybe?
Yeah. Maybe why you could be interested in listening to us in the first place. Like maybe give a little background.
Right.
Yeah. I love
So that's what we're doing. I'm Elisa, by the way.
I'm Katie.
And you're going to be hearing from us today.
Yeah. So settle in.
Yeah.
Get a nice glass of water. You're going to need to stay hydrated, or milk, Crystal Light.
If you want to be a true blue Mormon.
Wrap yourself tight in a blanket. Give yourself that really
until you feel protected from all that's about to come out of us. No, this isn't going to be that bad. It's just,
I know. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. I was writing my notes and definitely being like, I'm going to cry while we talk about this.
I had that thought too. I mean, we're talking about ourselves, but specifically about our pathways through and out of Mormonism.
Yeah.
And it turns out, like, just preparing for this episode, I was like, what was my path out?
Yeah.
And what were the key moments in it? And it turns out there's some real doozies in there.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, man. Yeah.
Let's start lighter, though.
Okay.
Maybe a quick, who are you, Katie? Tell the people.
Oh,
who
no.
are you?
I'm Katie. Wow. The way that my mind goes blank when I'm asked to introduce myself.
Right?
Who cares? A little bit of who cares, a little bit of who knows, Well, in like regards to our family structure, I'm the youngest sibling, which is relevant. I'm the youngest sibling by quite a bit. I'm so much younger than Elisa.
Yep, it's
crazy. What else about me? I grew up in Washington. I live in Oregon. I've always lived in this part of the country, this part of the world.
You're a Pacific Northwest gal through and through.
Through and through. I'm married. I've been married a long time. I have a child. I have a boy child. I'm pregnant, quite pregnant with another boy child, which is great.
Yes.
And that's what I be doing lately. I just be momming and podcasting and hanging out. And hobbies, interests, whatever I got time for. Who the hell knows?
I've been trying to think about like what would I say about you if I were introducing you.
Oh, sure.
And I feel like a couple of things that our listeners should know about you. And the first one is one they maybe do already. You are really funny. Oh. Katie is one of the funniest people, maybe the funniest person I know. Like the most, like you say things that I'm like, where on earth did you come up with that? Just in day-to-day conversation, the way Katie turns a phrase, I am consistently like, whoa, how did that happen? I'm in awe.
Thanks, pal.
So that's the thing about you. What else about you? Okay, so one thing I think we should talk about is our pop culture interests beyond Mormon pop culture.
Oh, sure.
And I was thinking about that with you because I feel like you have a very like diverse pop culture universe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. I've never been held down by anything in my life in regards to pop culture, music, TV and movies, books.
Yes. Just last night we were chatting about how you loved Gwen Stefani as a kid, but that was like you were like a little edgy for that because you were like a little young to be into Gwen Stefani.
And you said it in the context of like, can you believe she's married to Blake Shelton? And I'm like, I kind of get why she's married to Blake Shelton too. Like, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's true. I have always been a TV girl. A music girl, a movie girl all day long. And you could never guess where I'm going next. I like it all. Country music, classical music, anything. As long as it's stupid, I like it.
Yep.
What about you? I want to think about things about you. You're such a Taurus.
I'm such a Taurus.
You
I'm
are
so
also
cozy.
You're also super funny, and I feel like you're similar in terms of like your pop culture interests. Like you're obviously very smart and like academic. You have your PhD, but you also like know literally everything about like the Real Housewives. You're a Kardashian apologist.
I am. I'm like a Jane Austen girly for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
But also, I will defend Tom Cruise as one of the great actors of our generation. I mean, he is crashing helicopters, people.
Elisa, we can't get started.
I know, we can't talk about Tom Cruise. I'll never stop.
Yeah.
I do think too, in terms of birth order, I am the middle child, and I am a consummate middle child.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm always like, people don't remember me. It's just how I've lived my life.
And it's so funny because that's not how you're perceived at all. And I think that that's because you like you probably did have to fight against being ignored, or, you know, not necessarily ignored, but just not as seen as the other people around you. And so you have this like great personality, and you are super noticeable because you are different. And
that's very kind of you. Middle child, grew up in Washington with Katie over here. I went away to college at BYU, went on a mission. That's actually something I like have not talked a lot about in my real life for years. And so I think there are people who know me pretty well who maybe didn't even know that I'd gone on a Mormon mission, because it's just such a weird period of my life. But yeah, I went on a Mormon mission to upstate New York.
Ooh.
I went back to BYU for a master's degree, worked there for a year as visiting faculty, moved to Wisconsin for a job, worked in Wisconsin for a few years, got a PhD in Wisconsin, and then moved to California to be a professor. And then I've just recently left that job because it sucked. Woo! And now I'm doing other things, including this podcast. And Katie and I are writing a novel.
We sure are. We've never talked about that.
The main character is an ex-Mormon, and it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, it sure is.
So that's us.
And you're married.
Sisters. Oh yeah, and I'm married. Oh my God, Frank, how could I forget?
Hello, Frank.
And I'm married. I actually just got married like a year ago. We met when I moved here to California, and my husband is awesome. He's the best.
Yeah, for sure.
He never would be Mormon.
Never Mormon. He would be hilarious to have on the podcast.
Oh my God.
Like, just tell him only 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Have him on. Have him log in another room.
I know.
And then he'll just be like, what's going on?
Yeah. He jokes that he should be our producer, so he just like feeds us random questions. I think that would be sublime.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, he's busy.
Yeah, he's got a whole thing going on. I do think the show would benefit greatly
from his perspective.
For sure. I feel like we should preface us going into our backgrounds by sort of saying, well, we are sharing what we want to share because we want to share it and feel like people can probably connect with it. We both have like very different stories when it comes to leaving the church that are both perfectly relatable to all sorts of different people, but we don't feel like we have any right to like advise in any sort of way. We are just here to like commiserate, hang out.
I mean, that kind of gets at one thing we wanted to touch on was our purpose for the podcast, like what sort of led us to even starting this. And I think maybe let's tie that in first, because you've already started. We came to this project from a pop culture lover's standpoint. Like we were like, look at all this stuff coming out about Mormons. We were watching it. We had friends who were watching it. We had people who were never Mormon who were like, wait, is Under the Banner of Heaven real? Wait, are the Real Housewives of Salt Lake, like, is that like what your experience in the church was like? So that was kind of happening. And we were like, wouldn't it be fun to sit and talk about all these things and answer these questions for ourselves as much as for anyone? And then what we found inevitably is in answering those questions, we started deconstructing Mormonism on the podcast.
Yeah.
It was almost a byproduct of the goal instead of the goal itself.
Totally.
And I think one thing I've since learned being in more ex-Mormon spaces online is that there are a lot of folks who are like, I'm here to help other people learn about the church so they can leave it. I'm here to like coach you out, coach you through leaving.
Yeah.
And respectfully, that's not what we're claiming to do.
No, we could never.
We don't have the qualifications to do that. And I do think qualifications matter.
It can feel when you're going through it like, I just need somebody to relate to, somebody to talk to. But, upon deconstructing for myself, I now see that like professional help is needed.
Important. I agree.
So that's what you should get.
I agree. I will say there's no wrong way to do this. You do what you're going to do. And I had good friends who I could go to while leaving the church to talk about things and not feel alone. And I know that there are people who don't have that. And in that case, it's like, look, I need somebody and I do need help, and there are people offering help. We're not trying to say there's one right way to leave the church or anything like that.
No.
But we aren't claiming to be guides for leaving. The expertise we bring to this podcast comes from our own experience with Mormonism, and that's like what we're trying to share in the framework of this pop culture that we love. And the like only kind of quote unquote help we see ourselves offering is like solidarity, humor, empathy. And if the podcast helps you, that's amazing. Like that is so great. And we're so glad. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't help you, it just like kind of makes you laugh or makes you think or makes you go like, oh yeah, that happened to me too. That's great.
Yeah. I think that for some people, I know from my own experience, sometimes listening to or engaging with content like this can kind of make you feel bad. And like, that's okay. And you should just allow that and recognize it and,
act accordingly.
Right.
Like if you need a break from hearing about Mormons, we get it.
We sure do.
Oh, yeah.
Oy, oy, oy.
So, do you want to tell your story first? Do you want me to go first? What do you think?
Why don't you go first?
Okay.
Seniority.
I'll go first, but feel free to pop in.
I will. I'm sure.
Okay. So, like I said, I was kind of going through the events of my life in preparation for this podcast and trying to think of like what were these key moments, these key like eras of my experience within Mormonism. So that's kind of how I'm framing this in my own head. I will say I've always been kind of skeptical. I've always been someone who like asks questions, and I've definitely always been aware of absurdities within Mormonism, and especially within the people I encountered in Mormonism from a very young age. Like I remember us on Sundays after church sitting around the dinner table and we'd be like, sister so-and-so said this nuts thing today.
Yeah.
Like we were all aware of it. However, I am a middle child and I wanted to make my parents happy and make people happy and be good. Being the good kid was the way I got validation. And so I was very invested in being like a good little Mormon. And that really defined my life for honestly like 20 years. And there were like blips of rebellion. I went through a real rebellious stage in like the 5th grade.
Ooh.
Where I like swore and I would buy candy cigarettes at the corner drugstore.
Oh my gosh.
And then I went through another rebellion my senior year of high school where I went to rated R movies. Can you believe?
That's crazy.
But then I ended up at BYU, and that really pounded the Mormonism back into me for sure. Yeah. I think if I had gone to a different university, that was like a period of my life where I was starting to be more independent. Things could have gone differently. But I was at BYU, and you just get kind of immersed, wrapped up in all of it. At 21, I've graduated from BYU unmarried, and I'm like, I guess I have to go on a mission because my patriarchal blessing said so, even though I did not really want to do that. So I went to the temple for the first time. This was a big moment of dissonance. You're not prepared for it.
Yeah.
The temple prep classes do not prepare you. It's so strange. It's so different from like going to church on Sunday. It's so different even from like, you know, as a young Mormon, you can go to the temple and do like baptisms for the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty weird.
That is weird. That's like intro to weird.
It's definitely weird. But you would also been baptized at 8. So there's some familiarity to the act of being baptized that kind of keeps you from maybe freaking out.
Yeah.
But going to the temple to receive my endowment was strange and uncomfortable. I remember leaving. I'd gone with my parents, and my mom said, "You're not quite sure what to make of that, are you?" She could just see it on my face. And I was like, no, I'm not sure. It was so strange. I cannot emphasize that enough. And they invited me to ask questions. And the first question I asked was, you know, why does Eve have to covenant with Adam instead of with God directly? And the response I got was, don't go down that road. You know, that's not going to be a productive conversation.
You're asking the wrong questions.
Right. I've heard that more recently they've changed that in the temple, like within the last couple of years. And sure, good for them, whatever. But like, let's not pretend that that's not indicative of the Mormon woman experience in general. So I just left unsettled. And to be honest, I never really enjoyed going to the temple at all. It was like a thing I did as rarely as I could get away with and out of pure obligation. And I remember after going through the temple for the first time, this was right before my mission, a friend of mine who was also single but wasn't going on a mission, she just wanted to go to the temple. And that's like a thing that's a little bit discouraged. They're like, wait till you're going on a mission or getting married. And she asked me, like, should I go? If they'll let me, should I go? And I said no.
Yeah.
And I was like, the temple's not for single women, it's for married couples.
Yeah.
Married straight couples. And I remember she was like mad at me. She was like annoyed with my answer. She thought I think she thought I was like gatekeeping and trying to be like, no, I'm going on a mission. I'm better than you. But honestly, I was like, no.
Yeah, nah.
Then I go on a mission. This was another pivotal experience. My mission was an absolute mind fuck. The overarching lesson I was taught as a missionary again and again was that if I wasn't seeing the results that I'd been promised, it was because I wasn't sacrificing enough. So if people weren't getting baptized, it was because I needed to sacrifice more. And this thinking applied to everything. So like if I wasn't achieving something in my life, I needed to do more. If I wasn't seeing the blessings God had promised, it was on me. And that is a really problematic mental journey to go on. I remember standing up in meetings as a missionary, and we would be asked one by one, do you have the faith to baptize this transfer and every transfer? Transfer is 6 weeks. And you would say yes. And then you would not baptize every transfer. No one was.
Right.
And then it was like, okay, well, we need to give up more as a mission. So your lunches need to be shorter. You need to wake up earlier. You need to study harder. You need to. And it just went on and on and on. And it was brutal. It was really miserable. It was the first time in my life I ever felt depressed. I had never been someone who experienced that before, but I was so depressed. I was so anxious. I was so miserable. And when I did feel happy, which I did, and many times, it was like a mania.
Yeah.
Like I remember being like breathless with happiness. I mean, I was crazed. And I remember thinking, I'm going to need therapy. I'm not okay.
Yeah.
And you just had to put that out of your head and go.
Yeah. You were like starved for just like normal serotonin, dopamine intake, just regular life,
even just regular rest.
Yeah.
And just being able to turn off this, like the ledger in your head that's like, I'm giving this so God can do this. Oh, God's not doing that. I guess I have to give more and more and more. When in reality, like people getting baptized is not something I can possibly control. No matter how short my lunches are and how early I wake up in the morning.
Right.
But I like believed that, and I applied it to my life after my mission. Like I was like, oh, I'm not married and I've been promised that by my patriarchal blessing, by my mission president, by God, supposedly, right? So it's on me. What more do I need to give up? What more do I need to do? And whew, it was a lot. So I came home from my mission, very committed to Mormonism because I had just sacrificed a year and a half of my life to it, but also really disconnected from myself, from reality. And
For sure.
I went straight back to BYU. I was a grad student there, and then I was visiting faculty there for 1 year. And I was lucky that I met a really good therapist at the BYU Counseling Center, which could have gone very differently.
Yeah.
And he helped me to kind of identify the unhealthy mental pattern I was in. And that was great. That was great. That was important for me. But I couldn't help but think, if this mental pattern that we're talking about is unhealthy, why is it what I've been taught?
Yeah.
Why is it what the church teaches? If it's like psychologically damaging, why was my mission president saying this? Why are the general authorities saying this?
Yeah, you were just doing what was encouraged.
Right.
And I feel like in retrospect, sorry to interrupt.
No.
I can remember
please.
when you got home from your mission, and I remember you seeming manic. I remember you telling me that you couldn't listen to music. You know, you were struggling to like get back into just being a person.
Yeah.
That's really traumatic. Like you hear that from lots of people. Like that's a normal thing that missionaries experience. They get home and it takes them a while to be able to watch television or listen to secular music or like just start hanging out with people.
Yeah.
Being an individual.
I like couldn't read a book.
Yeah.
Like I remember trying to read, like the last Harry Potter book had come out while I was on my mission. I remember being excited to read it, and I like literally couldn't. I just couldn't process it. I couldn't focus on it. I was just in distress. It was a really weird time.
For sure.
And I was really unhappy. And I was like, aren't I supposed to be so happy? I just made this huge sacrifice of my life to go serve God, serve the Lord, serve the church. Isn't this when I'm supposed to feel great? Like I did that thing. I did it well. I gave my whole heart to it. Like, shouldn't this feel good? And of course the problem was me. You know, it had to be me.
Right.
So I'm back at BYU, but I'm finding no pleasure in being there. Not in the same way that I had before. Like there was academic pleasure and like learning and stuff, but going to church was a misery. I remember distinctly I was the Relief Society president and I could barely get myself out of bed in the morning because I was fucking depressed to go to church. And so I would just go to Relief Society and I felt bad about it.
Yeah.
And I remember driving to church one day and feeling bad and having this distinct impression, as if a spiritual prompting, that God did not care if I went to church, that it didn't matter. And that was comforting, but also confusing.
Yeah.
Prop 8 was going on, and at BYU, that was big. We were being told we needed to like be in the phone banks calling people, telling them to vote for Prop 8 and make gay marriage illegal. And I was extremely uncomfortable with that. It did not align with my values. Yeah. A lot of dissonance.
It was a terrible time to be a Mormon.
It was the first time for me that I was like, no, this is not who I am. This is like toxic. So another big pivotal experience for me is that I had a kind of situationship with a guy that I'd met at BYU as a grad student. And it turned out he was gay and a Mormon and not fully out necessarily. And he sort of pitched me the idea that we get married because we were great friends, you know. And I had never really heard of a mixed orientation marriage, so I became familiar with it and I contemplated it. And this is another thing I don't talk a lot about because it's not something that is easy to talk about.
No, not at all.
But I contemplated it and I'm feeling emotional for some reason.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm not exactly sure why. Because it's old. It's been so long, you know, it's so long resolved. But it was really a fucked up situation.
Yeah, it was.
I think the thing that has stayed with me that did the most harm was that there were adults in my life and in his life, friends, family, church leaders who we went to with this. Is this something we should do? Is this a real viable path? And those people should have protected us and should have steered us in a reasonable direction. And instead, we both were encouraged to pursue that relationship and a mixed orientation marriage. I remember he was told, like, oh, sex and marriage, it's just such a small thing. It's not that important. What's really important is XYZ. The reaction I got was like, well, getting married to a Mormon guy, I mean, you're already 24 or whatever, however old, 25. You gotta, it's so important that you do this. Getting married to a Mormon was more important than getting married to someone who loved me or could love me or who would be happy being married to me. I mean, it was just, we were not protected. We were both led down a path that was wrong.
Yeah.
I can't speak for him. We're both fine.
Yeah.
We're both good. And we have never he and I have never unpacked it.
Oh.
Not really.
Mm-hmm.
But I was fucked up by this for a while.
Yeah, for sure.
I kind of disconnected from myself, I think, to protect myself from just all of the misery that this sort of stirred up in me and all of the feelings of like being unlovable and the church kind of telling me that I wasn't a real person unless I was married. And so even though the church was what was harming me, I couldn't leave it because I couldn't even think deeply enough about what was happening to identify the church as the problem at that point. So, yeah, that was a dark era too. And honestly, though we made the right decision, I made the right decision. I was like, no, this person can't love me. This is not what I want. This is not good.
Yeah.
I didn't date for years, like 5, 6 after that, because I was so messed up.
Yeah, that was a situation that should have been stopped.
Yeah. Like I remember talking to our parents who I think would do it all differently in retrospect.
Yeah, for sure.
But at the time they were like, well, maybe that could be great. We love the idea of you getting married in the temple to a nice boy. There was not a lot of digging deeper.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. In retrospect, that's just...
It was wrong.
Unbelievable.
And we were harmed I was harmed by it.
You were.
So yeah, that wasn't great. Moving on past probably the darkest era, honestly. After all of that settled, I was getting a PhD. That was a great time in my life. I was being treated like a whole person in a way that wasn't what I had experienced a whole lot as a young woman in the church. I was asking a lot of questions. I was learning to think in new ways. Like, it was really great. But the contrast of that experience with my experience in the church was so stark that it, I think, really contributed to me eventually leaving because I was so invisible in the church. At that point, I was in my early 30s. I was single. I was in a family ward and I was truly marginalized, as much as a white woman in the church can be. I remember we'd be in like Relief Society, and they'd say like, turn to your neighbor and share a trial. And the woman next to me would turn to me, a woman who knew my situation, and would say, my biggest trial is that I got married so late. I was 25. I never thought I'd get married. It was so hard. It was such a trial in my faith. But then I got married. And so like the Lord resolves everything. And I would sit there and think like, what's happening?
Yeah. Am I invisible?
Right. Like, do you literally not think of me as a person? Other examples, like I was never invited to socialize with adults in the ward because I was single. Presumably, maybe they just didn't like me, but I'm a pretty nice person. But I would get invited to babysit while the adults got together to socialize. So like a couple would plan a thing and invite other couples in the ward. And then one of the women would call me, a woman my age or younger would call me and say, would you like to come watch my kids while I go to Sister So-and-so's house for a little dinner party? And I was like, no, I'm not looking for babysitting opportunities. And the fact that that's how you think of me, instead of thinking to invite me to the thing, I mean, it was just constant. It was constant. There was one other sort of big moment where I'd been teaching gospel doctrine in the ward for over a year. And this man in the ward who attended gospel doctrine every Sunday, participated, I ran into him around town one day, he and his wife. She said hi to me and he looked at me and was like, "Oh, are you?" And he had no idea who I was. And he was in my gospel doctrine class every Sunday for over a year. He had it was like he had never seen me before.
Wow, I think that says more about him.
Of course it does. But I mean, that's the problem, right?
That's crazy.
Like single members of the church. I mean, that is
a
horrible position to be in. The church is not set up for those people. And it's a miserable experience and I hated it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm getting my PhD. I'm single in the church. I read the CES letter. And it's a thing I've been aware of, but I haven't intentionally engaged with it just because, not that I was afraid to, but I just hadn't. And so I read it and it doesn't really rock me. And I think it's mostly because at that point, I had pretty much come to grips with the fact that the church was illogical and problematic and toxic. I'd been to enough therapy. I was in touch enough with my emotions. I'd had enough kind of shitty experiences that I didn't expect reason and logic from the church anymore.
Yeah. And you knew a lot about the Mormon history.
Of course I
really is what normally would cause people to freak out.
Right. I also read a lot, had studied a lot. I was aware of problems with the Book of Mormon, of problems with like the rhetoric in the church. It just didn't bowl me over or anything. But that was telling, right? That I was kind of like, yeah, well, of course. There are all these problems because staying in the church at that point wasn't about the church being logical and reasonable and verifiable. It was a test of endurance. Could I hold on even though everything wasn't working out the way it had been taught? I wasn't feeling the way I was supposed to be feeling because that had been going on at this point for a decade. And to be frank, I was the last kid in the family who was still in. And I felt like I should be loyal to the family tradition for our parents' sake. And that was what it was about. Yeah.
There's a lot of pressure there.
Right. There was a lot of pressure there. I also, again, was single. And so I didn't have my own kind of family unit at that point. I really had our parents. And so it was like, no, I got to stick with this. So I went through a period of time where I remember saying to people, I don't really believe anything. Like, I can't know that the church is true, but I can't know that it's not true either. So I'm just gonna like not worry about it. But that, of course, is not actually possible.
That can only take you so far.
Right. In 2015, when the new policy about LGBTQ members and their children was leaked, I remember thinking, this is horrible. This seems like a scam because it's so unbelievably villainous. But then it was true. And I think I've talked about this on the podcast. Our mom called me and she was upset by it too. But she said to me, like, I'm worried this is going to make you lose your faith. And in that moment, I knew, well, I it's gone. I lost that a while ago.
Right. My faith is not of concern right now. This is concerning. Like,
yeah. But even then I stayed. And this is the era of my life that's been the hardest for me to understand. Like, why didn't I just leave? I didn't believe in it. I wasn't enjoying it. I had no sense of community there anymore. I'd had so many friends leave the church at that point, so much family leave the church. Like, why not just go? And this is one of the weirdest twists of all, but I stayed in to some extent because I was an academic finishing a PhD. And for a decade, BYU had been like, hey, if you want to come back, hey, if you get that PhD, come back. Hey, think of us when you're applying, come back. I know many people who've had this experience too, friends of mine in academia, where their old department was like, hey, think of us. Because they are looking to hire active members of the church. And there are only so many with PhDs. So they kind of court you a little, but it turns out it's pretty disingenuous. It has been for a lot of my friends, and it was for me. So I was physically in, completely mentally out. I was dating outside of the church at that point and all that entails. I was like sinning in small ways and being like, do I feel guilty? Nope. I feel fine. Is this scary? Nope. It's fine. And so that was happening, but I was also still like in enough that when the time came, if I needed a job and BYU was the only place that would hire me because academic jobs are hard to come by, I could maybe sneak through. And I think I held on for a couple more years because of that fear that I wouldn't be able to be a professor if I burned that bridge at BYU.
Yeah.
And then I was finishing my PhD. I was applying for jobs. I did apply at BYU. And I had talked with people in the department and I got an unceremonious form email. They didn't even consider my application. After all those years of like, think of us, come here. Not even a, hey, Elisa, we know you. Let's talk to you for real. Nothing.
Yeah.
And I was sort of like, great. That's the last little tiny thread here. There's nothing to pretend for anymore. And that was it. I will say, I did get a job as a professor and I did move for that job. And when I moved to California, I did go to church again a couple times because I was living in a new state where I knew nobody. And I was like, not that I wanted to go back to church, but maybe I can find other sort of physically and mentally out Mormons who share a similar background to me and we can be friends. So I'll go to church in this mid-singles ward a couple times and it was a disaster. Like first Sunday, I met with the bishop and he was kind of sexist. And then he was like, oh, can we meet? And I was like, you know what? I think I'm good. I think I'm going to stop coming. And he sent me these really kind of like emotionally manipulative texts that were like, oh, but give me a chance. You haven't even given me a chance. Like, I'm not a bad guy. And I was like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
And that was truly, I mean, I had been out, but that was just like, okay, bye-bye. Cherry on top.
That's enough.
And that's it. That is my long path out. And since being out, I've learned even more about all the terrible church history and all of the illogical bullshit of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith, and dug more into the horrific rhetoric of church leaders over the century and a half or however long it's been. But all of that's been kind of in retrospect. All of that's been kind of like confirmation of a decision I made a long time ago.
Yeah.
That the church just wasn't for me.
That's been a benefit of starting this podcast. Definitely. There have been some enlightening moments just in the 20 weeks that we've been doing this. It's interesting when those things come up that for some reason you just didn't know until now and you're like, well, affirmed.
Yes, right?
Isn't that nice?
It is nice. It's very validating.
Yeah.
What about you, Katie?
And to be going through this with you.
Yeah,
all
I
the
know.
better.
It's been such a pleasure. So glad we're buddies.
Yeah, me too. Well, what about me? My answer to that question is going to be very different because mine is the story of a child and not an adult woman. But I do think still that it is, I'm sure, relatable to many people. I think I really wasn't very skeptical of the church when I was very little. I was really skeptical of myself within the church. So from a young age, you know, you're told when you should feel the spirit, how it should feel. And that just wasn't something that I experienced. I think that I, like you, was like a very discerning little kid. And I think I normally was very skeptical, but I think I had this like underlying fear in regards to the church. And, you know, with the expectations that there were of me, like they were pretty clear and they were always pretty intense. Even though we didn't grow up in Utah, we were still very much immersed in that Mormon culture, and we had like a very Mormon extended family and pioneer heritage. And
not to interrupt, I feel like that's a pretty key thing about our upbringing we haven't said is like on all sides of our family, it's like from Joseph Smith's time, we've been in the church.
Yeah. Our family traveled across the country in handcart companies and like across the board. Like we are like all pioneer heritage.
Yes.
We're descendants of John Taylor. Though not the like proud descendants of John Taylor. He did not unfortunately claim our family. He chose another one. But doesn't change the fact that he's our grandpa. Yeah. So that's definitely worth mentioning. I think it definitely played a role. Like there was an expectation of us in terms of our behavior. I think maybe especially because we didn't grow up in Utah. We were supposed to be this example of the right behavior and the right way to look. And so there were just a lot of expectations. It was pretty rigid when it came down to like the way you talk, the way you dress. And I had a really hard time with that. I have never really had control of my mouth. It's like a very separate organ from the rest of my body. And I've always been a smart ass. And I've always been a nice person. And I always really cared about how I presented myself, but I was just a kid. I mean, I think in retrospect, just a normal kid. And I really had a hard time with that. And so the expectations just kind of amassed, you know. You should be feeling the spirit, having spiritual experiences leading up to baptism. There's just it's a lot. It's a lot to put a little kid's mind through. And on top of it, I mean, church was weird. Sunday school teachers start saying some weird shit as you get older. And so then you really do start questioning things. I think around the time when I turned 8, the age of accountability, things really like the cracks began to show, and I was scared, and I started to kind of have like a nervous breakdown surrounding my faith. It wasn't my faith, it was just me. You know, when you're a kid, you don't have the ability to separate yourself from it, really. So I was just a very nervous kid. I think to I think to the people around me, it probably registered more like I was really conscientious. And like I really cared about doing the right things. But in retrospect, there was something really wrong going on. Every day was just tears and like setting conditions for myself, shame, manifesting physically. I have really traumatic memories of having panic attacks as a little kid, which I didn't know that that's what was happening, but I do now. I have one specific memory of I think you were there, and maybe our brother or our mom, and we were watching TV, and I'm sitting on the floor and everybody else is behind me, and I'm watching the I'm Blue Dabba Dee music video by Eiffel 65, which dates this perfectly, I think.
Yes.
And I don't know what triggered this. Something clearly was coming to a head in my mind and in my body, and I started having a panic attack. And I just remember it, so it was just so visual. I've never forgotten it. And I was just like overcome. And I remember that being like the first time I learned how to like breathe really deep, you know, breathe in and breathe out, almost like you're yawning, and then you'll work through the nausea and sit really still so nobody can see that you're freaking out. And I was so afraid that if I moved or if I got up and went to the bathroom and threw up, that people would know. And I was probably 7 when that started happening.
Can I say, as your older sister, I remember it was like, Katie's nervous. She's a nervous kid. She's got a lot of fears. I remember that was kind of the narrative of you as a kid in the family. But there was just like no digging into like what's she afraid of?
Yeah.
What's the root of this fear? You know, and I was a kid too. I didn't know what the hell was going on with anything.
Yeah.
But so it's so interesting to me to hear you talk about it, because it was so much deeper than what was being acknowledged.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, what a quirk that she's kind of nervous. Isn't that funny? Like she'll get over it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really how everybody saw it at the time. I think in retrospect that all the people who were adults who observed that at the time would now recognize that it was deeper than that. And they have, to me. It was a real mindfuck there for a while. I mean, for a really long time. So like I said, that was probably when I was like 7 or 8 when that started happening. And then I got baptized, and it kind of shifted. I mean, baptism was a real weird thing for me because I did not feel ready. I didn't feel worthy, but I couldn't say no. They tell you can, but you can't.
No.
And I was really frightened by it, and that manifested in a really strong fear of the actual act of getting baptized.
I remember this. I do. I remember you didn't want to put your face in the water. Yeah.
So that was really hard for me. The actual baptism was really traumatizing for me because I ended up needing to get dunked like I don't even know how many times because I wasn't getting completely immersed in the water.
Oh my gosh. I'm remembering this as you're talking about it.
Yeah.
And again, we were all like, she's got a fear of water.
I know. Yeah. and you can't say anything. I can't actually say to my parents that I'm feeling like really desperately afraid and that I feel guilt all the time. And for me, the only thing I would say is I would say, am I a bad kid? Am I a bad kid? You know, all the time. And all they would say is, no, of course not. Because according to what they were observing, I was very conscientious, but it kind of evolved, and I developed this propensity to committing little acts of sin. It was like very early rebellion. And I really don't have like the knowledge or the vocabulary to really know what that was. But it was like in response to all this shame I was feeling. I was feeling miserable all the time as this little kid. So yeah, it was like little things, stickers and hair ties and just taking little things and things that I could keep secret, like lying and just telling little lies all the time. And I just couldn't really control it. And it's not necessarily like I didn't care. I felt terrible about it, but I just had this weird inclination to just keep doing these things. But it just got really big, and I became really depressed and kind of just like disengaged from life from a really young age. And I would say I probably started to feel really depressed in middle school. It just reached a point where I was like really alone, had nobody to talk to about my shame, and I was really different than other kids, you know, being Mormon. I like appear one way and I feel so strongly another way, but I had no words, you know.
It probably didn't help too that you were suddenly an only child.
Yeah, and I was suddenly an only child.
Because Chris and I both were gone.
Yeah, that was really hard. And I was really detached from the church at that point. By the time I was probably 12, you know, like I was participating in it, but I was probably pretty resentful even by then, and just angry. And I felt like hurt by it all the time. But there was like no way for me to say that I was hurt, you know? Because if you do, it's, oh, well, sorry, we're trying to like save you and we want you to go to heaven. And I don't know, it was enormously difficult. So by the time I got into high school, I was just sleeping all the time, still going to church, but just it was expected of me. I went to seminary through high school. I think I stopped going my senior year. I think I ended up telling my parents that I wanted to be done with the church around my senior year. And then I continued to go to church, but I stopped going to seminary. But
I remember driving you to seminary when I was home after my mission. And you didn't want to be going.
No, I was not participating in it whatsoever.
And you had crazy seminary teachers. I remember your seminary teacher was like, Obama is the Antichrist.
Totally. They were bonkers.
Yeah.
But luckily, well, not luckily, my depression really came to a head when I was probably like 13 or 14, and I was like not doing anything but sleeping when I wasn't at school. And my parents, I guess, or I don't know if they thought this or if it was the doctor's idea, but they drug tested me because I was acting like I was on drugs, I guess. Was not on drugs yet, just depressed, which luckily the doctor picked up on. And so I started to get help for that. And that was
crazy to me that they would drug test you before they would
have a conversation. Yeah. And like I said, it might have been the doctor's idea. I don't know. And so, yeah, luckily I started to like get help from adults who were outside of the church. And I was able to voice like what I was experiencing and be empathized with in a way like I had never been. I had never felt that true empathy in regards to how I felt like I was victimized by the church.
Yeah.
And my experiences were big, and it's okay if my feelings around them were big. Like that was just never okay. It was, you know, just a buck up kind of situation always. And I had spent so long just trying to make everything as small as I possibly could. Like in retrospect, that's really the only way that I can think about it, is like I was just trying to, you know, make my feelings small and like hopefully desensitize myself to the shame that I felt around the church and
shrink yourself into the mold.
and just shrink myself. But, you know, as you know, like in the church, you feel conflicted. And I was still a very young person and very impressionable. I was still going to EFY, which is a weird experience. I mean, it's like weird brainwashing.
Yes.
Propaganda weirdness. So there was like that element. And I did have a testimony of Joseph Smith up to like a pretty late point. I for whatever reason, like that's what my brain
I had
really
the
held on
same
to.
thing, Katie. That's so funny. I remember saying, like, I have a testimony of Joseph Smith even more than I had a testimony of like Jesus.
Yeah, for sure.
I like believed in Joseph Smith as a prophet.
Yeah. I think that there's something to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, like I can remember begrudgingly going to Temple Square on family vacations to Utah and sitting down and watching the restoration and being like swept up in it.
Yeah, it was so dramatic and emotional. That movie, man, they really got you. I remember watching that at the end of my mission. And I remember at the end, everybody's in tears.
Yeah.
And my mission president stood up and said, I bet you feel like you're on the right team, don't you?
Oof. Yeah.
And I was like, yes.
Yikes. So yeah, I kind of abruptly left the church then when I became an adult, when I turned 18, because I knew that I like desperately needed to, because I had had that lifetime of just trauma. You know, I wouldn't have labeled it that back then, but I would now. I just felt so sad and so overcome with shame and just burdened by the expectations and confused, because it's so confusing.
So confusing.
But also conflicted because I did have faith, because it's, you know, the church works, you know.
Right.
And so I just like very abruptly left when I was 18. I didn't really look back, and it took me several years to like look inward and to consider things like the CES letter and to, I don't know, like allow myself to really think about it. And luckily that did happen and has led us here, which has been really great. But it's I'll carry those experiences with me forever. They definitely shaped who I am and like how I know myself. You know, it's funny like talking about myself being like a scared kid, because I'm just so not.
Right.
I'm not a scared person.
No.
I'm a happy, joyful, adventurous person.
Yes.
That it's been really a blessing to get to know myself for real outside of the context of that religion.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the same thing as you were talking about that. It's just such a far cry from like who you are now. And I remember learning things about you. Like there were periods of your life that you didn't really share with me at the time that you were in them because of where I was, where you were. But like I remember you telling me stories from after you'd left the church about like things you had done that were kind of risky. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
Katie doesn't take risks. Katie's afraid. And it's like the thing that you were afraid of had been removed.
Yeah.
It was the church all along. It wasn't living. It wasn't the world. It was like this framework of belief that was just pummeling you with fear.
Yeah. It was very much a specific thing.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, I have had lifelong like anxiety, like I am an anxious person, but I think it is related to those experiences. I don't think that it's necessarily innate. It's a kind of just a response that my body has learned. And it doesn't super affect my day to day. I don't struggle with like really overwhelming anxiety. I just struggle with, like I've talked about, my sleep paralysis demons.
Yes.
And things like that. That's generally how it manifests, not in the day to day, fortunately. But it's a wonderful life.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that stands out to me in your, well, two things that stood out to me as you were talking. One is I've always like really admired that you had the guts to just tell our parents when you were 18, like, I'm not doing this anymore. Because it took me until I was 38,
Yeah.
long after I'd even left, to say
Mhm.
anything to them. I just didn't tell them for
Yeah.
years. So that is has always really blown me away, that courage.
Mhm.
And then the other thing I'm thinking about is how you, like you said, you got help from adults outside of the church. And
Mhm.
I just think if I had had any real awareness of mental health from a non-LDS perspective earlier in life, what a difference
I
that
think it
could
made
make.
all the difference in the world. Like, I remember he would say things to me about the ways that I was wanting to experiment as a teenager. And he would be
Mhm.
very much like, that's normal. You're fine.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you want to smoke weed? That's safe on your medication. You're
Mhm.
going to be okay. Is that what you're wanting to know? Like, you're wanting to tell me if it's right or wrong? He's like, nobody cares. Like,
Yeah.
you're going to be fine. It won't kill you. Are you
Yeah.
afraid of dying? And
Yeah.
that's when I realized, I'm like, oh wow, it doesn't matter. Okay. And just things like that,
Mhm.
I was actually filmed during those sessions because they were
Oh.
technically for a study. I
Mhm.
was a part of a study at UW. It was pretty incredible. He would show me stills from when I first started when I was 14. And then when
Mhm.
I was 17 or 18, he showed me some of my last. And I was a totally different person. I was
Mm.
totally as a 14-year-old, I was slug person.
Aw.
Just so worn down. And as I got older, it's almost like I looked younger and
Yeah.
just happier, more confident.
Lighter.
I literally was just so
Mhm.
crouched and hiding when I was a younger kid. And that was really cool.
Yeah. The burden had been lifted a little bit.
Yeah.
That's kind of beautiful. I have a lot of feelings. When I listen to your story, I have a lot of feelings. As your older sister, I just, feel very protective of you.
That's the hard thing about talking about my journey out of the church is, like I said, it's because it's a child's story. It's
Mhm.
very upsetting to me. It makes me
Yeah.
feel very angry because I do still have full body reactions to thinking about these times. It wasn't
Mhm.
just, oh, it was hard. Oh, it didn't feel very good. It was no, the worst I've ever felt in my life was when I was 7 or
Yeah.
8.
You were a
That's
little
not
child. You
right.
should have been protected.
Yeah.
How do you feel now?
Fabulous.
Mhm.
Fabulous, beautiful, sparkling. I feel good. I feel mostly completely at peace about all of it.
Mhm.
And with little sprinkles of anger
Mhm.
and resentment and the traumatic memory here and there.
Mhm.
I think especially as a mother, I feel very you just see yourself in your kids. And so it
Yeah.
makes me a little sad sometimes.
Mhm.
But I'm very happy to be exactly where I am, where we
Mhm.
are together.
Mhm.
And I try to look at it as as much as I can as maybe it's a fun mystery because there is that sort of heritage
Mhm.
family history element. I'm uncovering every horrific thing we uncover about our family history is a fun, I'm
Yeah.
blowing the
Yeah.
dust off an old map.
No,
Yeah.
I feel the same way. There is an element of humor and delight to some of
Mm-hmm.
it. As you learn the truth
Mm-hmm.
of the history of the church and you think about our ancestors being caught up in all these shenanigans, it is kind of wow, what a legacy.
Yeah, it's a bizarre
Yeah.
legacy. I'm at the point now where obviously we have a podcast about it. People are like, "Oh shit, you were Mormon." I can talk about it and
Yeah.
answer questions because there have been times in my life where I couldn't and
Oh my
just wouldn't,
gosh. I would be like, I don't want you to even know that about me.
Yeah.
It made me so uncomfortable because I felt like I had to defend it or I had to justify myself or I had to distance myself. And now I can just talk about it.
Yeah.
It's a lot better on the other side. Some of the very best things that have ever happened in my life have happened since I left the church. And honestly, leaving the church was a catalyst for those great things to
Yeah.
happen. And I feel great about that.
Yeah, amen.
I thought this would be a little 20-minute short and sweet, but here we are. Digging deep.
An epic tale.
Thanks so much for listening, everybody. Y'all are great.
Please bless y'all. Please bless you all. You, Elisa. Thanks so much for sharing.
Please bless you, Katie.
Thanks.
And please bless this podcast.
Amen.